Dear sister, thank you for being here. I appreciate you giving us some of your time. Let's start before we get too far into it. What is your name, and how long were you a Seventh-Day Adventist?
I'm Teresa Beam, and I was a Seventh-Day Adventist for 39 years. I was born on the same day as Martin Luther. And interestingly, I found that out when I was a little girl, and that affected me throughout my entire life. I studied him. I took classes, university classes on him. I read everything that he wrote. For some weird reason, I thought there was a cosmic reason for me being born on the same date not the date, but the day he was born. And God had placed me in proximity to this great reformer. And anyway, so my life has been unusual. And for you to understand me, this fact that my life has been so unusual has been foremost in my worldview. But I'm going to lay out why my life has been unusual, and I'm just going to hit some of the points. Neither of my grandfathers graduated from high school, but they both compensated by being overly educated. They both read voraciously, and my grandfather on my dad's side knew everything about history. My grandfather on my mother's side knew everything about business and history, church history, and he could also read Latin. From the time he was like 13, he could read Latin. So I grew up in a family that highly prized self-education. Whether or not you went to school didn't matter. I mean, they didn't care they still just wanted you. Like my grandfather said that he, on my mother's side, said he read 3 or 4 books a week. And my dad continuously had this mantra of growing up that he told us kids. He said, think, think, think. Think for yourself and don't be spoon-fed. So we were all very independent thinkers, as you can imagine. Okay, so my mother's father was an extremely successful businessman.
Temco Vought, one of the fastest growing major corporations in the United States, is a highly diversified enterprise composed of 11 publicly owned companies with more than 125,000 employees, competing in more than 30 diverse markets, with more than 15,000 products and services to serve the increasing demands of millions, better, faster, more economically, and more conveniently. A company that will never be dependent upon any one market, any one product, or any one technology to sustain its progress and growth. To freeze LTV into any history is like trying to stop time. It simply cannot be done, for it is a constantly changing entity, different today from the company it was yesterday. But you can pick a moment, stop the clock, and say, this is the LTV we speak of. LTV as it is today.
And I grew up actually seeing articles about him in the New York Times, and his face was on the cover of Business Week and Time magazine. He rebuilt a house in Dallas to resemble Versailles Palace, and that was just a few minutes from our house. It had a gatehouse that announced your arrival to the main house. It was just so cool. When we'd arrive, the guy at the gatehouse would say, "Oh, the fries are here." And then the gate would slowly open. It was just so cool. They had a pool next to a pool house, or it was really like a junior Olympic pool. So it was this huge pool. The pool house was larger than most people's homes. And this house was about 25 times bigger than my other grandfather's home, which was quite the opposite. The Fries, which that's my maiden name. My name's Teresa Beam, that's my married name, and Fry was my maiden name. So my other grandparents had an 800 square foot house in Grapevine. And it was a very old, just frame house. It was a sweet little house, but it was very small. And they just had a very different lifestyle. So my childhood was spent going between spending summers at the elite and lavish Brook Hollow Country Club in Dallas, while my father played golf or my mother played tennis, or, it was just really cool. At night, we'd go to my grandfather's mansion, and he had a butler and a staff of all these people that worked for him that would meet your every need. And then the other side was sitting outside that little old house on a hot Texas summer day, watching my other grandfather cutting open a watermelon that he had grown in his garden. And then we'd get to go drive into the little town of Grapevine and buy snow cones. So it was very simple. They had no money. And I loved them both and respected them both equally. And I didn't have any idea that this wasn't a normal childhood. But this experience gave me a 50-yard line seat to see what money was capable of doing. And I came to realize that the very rich and the very poor had way more in common than the middle class. They both understood that money doesn't make you happy. So that was unusual. And then I was the oldest girl of 6 kids. And we all sang together, like an Adventist Von Trapp family. We would go around, we'd sing in church, we'd sing at parties, we'd sing at weddings. And so we performed a lot. And it was a lot of fun. But again, that's very unusual. But one thing I forgot to tell you, I grew up, because I told you about my grandparents' houses, but my family lived in a large estate called Blossom Manor. And it was designed in the 1920s by this British architect, Sir Alfred Bossum. And it was in the Lakewood area of Dallas, Texas. Now, what's really interesting about this house, which I don't have time today to talk much about, but what's interesting is my parents bought it for next to nothing because there were rumors that it was haunted. And we believe that's quite possible because of a lot of stories I have about that house, that a lot of Adventists, I don't know if you would know Penny Estes Wheeler. She's a cousin of ours, and she worked at Junior Guide, or I think it was Junior Guide for years, and she would write about our experiences in this haunted house. For my first year in school, my grandfathers, the rich grandparents, really wanted me to go to nice schools, like super high elite schools. And so I went for the first year in first grade, but my mom finally realized, no, she wants me to grow up an Adventist. So they took me and put me in Dallas Junior Academy. And that was on Central Expressway in Dallas. But understand, I was a very happy child. I didn't care where I was. I was a very, very happy child. Another weird note is Vernon Howell. You might remember him, a.k.a. David Koresh.
Between what's right is right, it's Christ, and what's wrong is wrong, that's the devil. And I have to admit, doing right in my life and doing wrong in my life. But
This was David Koresh when we first met him in an exclusive interview back in 1987. At the time, he was known as Vernon Howell, and he was involved in a deadly dispute for control of the Branch Davidian sect.
Remember the big inferno in Waco? And anyway, he was there and went to the same elementary school that I did for at least a couple of years. And David Koresh worked with my dad for a while building, one of our houses when we eventually would move to Keene, Texas. But in one of those houses that we lived in that he built, Vernon Howell came in and he would put up sheetrock. And one time he grabbed me and made me sit down, and he sketched out on the sheetrock all his prophecies and the timeline. And somewhere, if people knew, that underneath there in that house, underneath the, I don't know if they put what they've done, but there's a big David Koresh prophecy chart right there. So that was kind of an interesting thing that happened to me. And I married my high school sweetheart, who I met at Valley Grande Academy in Weslaco, Texas. That was an SDA boarding school on the border of Texas and Mexico. And I've got a Bachelor of Arts degree in vocal performance and in English. Both sides of my parents were Adventists on their maternal side. My mother's father was a Catholic, but very nominally, and my dad's father was an atheist. Now, my grandmothers were not devout Adventists. They were not strict, and they came from a background of Adventism. So the generational ennui had already settled into their generation. My mother's mother did cycle through times when she was more strict, so we saw what strict looked like when it, what it could look like anyway in Adventism, but after a few years she relaxed. So our family was from Dallas, and we grew up there surrounded by wonderful, generous, and fairly normal people. The Dallas First Seventh-Day Adventist Church had a lot of progressive Adventists, and they were not very strict. I grew up around the Gilley family. Jim Gilley, some people will recognize his name.
Carried away. He said, well, we'll carry you away. And so I've tried to get through here in my normal 42 minutes. Maybe shorten it down a little bit if I can. Would love to bring a lot of word to you about 3ABN. Let me simply bring greetings from Danny and all the...
He would later become president of 3ABN, which is the Three Angels Broadcasting Network. And that was a great, great church. I sometimes even wonder if we'd stayed in Dallas and stayed at that church, if I would have ever left Adventism. So as wonderful as it was, I'm thankful we left for that one reason. So growing up, Sabbaths were the reason for the week. We were allowed sweets on Sabbath, and that often started with donuts. So we loved Sabbath. Then we'd go out to eat with our friends, mostly Mexican food, because we lived in Texas, and that's what everybody ate. And I can tell you very honestly, we had roast preacher for every Sabbath dinner. Our friends would get together, and my dad and his friends would argue every single thing that the preacher said and discuss Adventism. And every Sabbath we'd have guests over. Most Sabbaths we'd have lots of people in our house, and we'd play Sabbathy games, that kind of thing, until the sun went down, and then we'd go swim in our pool. And my family was very involved in the church and church school. And while my family didn't really push Ellen White, we pushed the wholesome values and fun Christianity. I mean, my mother, oh my word, there was no way on earth we would ever lie. This woman was she was like that dog that can smell things out and go ahead, a hound dog. And I mean, she could smell when anybody was telling a lie, and she was not going to let it go. So she was very, very into making sure we lived righteously, but they really didn't push Ellen White. Now, she loved Ellen White, but she didn't really push him. We didn't really ever read the Morning Watch or anything like that, but she did send us to Adventist churches. At church and school. In our house, there were groups like the AYA, that was the Adventist Youth Association, that a lot of times they would sing, and they'd come into town, to sing at the church. And so I grew up in the 1970s and 80s. Now, when the Dallas church seemed to be the hub of a lot of stuff that went around as far as Adventism, because they had a lot of people that were high up, or at least family that had high up in the GC and stuff. So we had this great big breath of fresh air come through the Dallas First Central Church. And it was a breath of fresh air of righteousness by faith. And my dad had been teaching us righteousness by faith in our house since we were little. So it was really wonderful to see this going through, because we immediately was like, oh yeah, that's familiar. That's what my dad's always taught us. At my church, there were some traditional Adventists who tried to hold the line, but I was there to see it. It was really interesting. I remember the Dallas church that had whispers of scandal when the Adventist public scandal hadn't quite gotten out to other groups. And this caused my mother to do a lot of grieving, because she was a big fan of E.G. White, and my dad had attended some seminary classes at Andrews because he was going to be an SDA pastor, but he gave up on it. He said that when he was at Andrews University, that the teachers told him that we made way too much of a big deal about Ellen White, that she was actually a nice, good Christian woman who the Seventh-Day Adventist Church made made into a bigger deal and made her into this infallible prophet. They said she was not. And, back off, pastors, about making her, this infallible prophet. And so during my elementary and academy years, I remember just very vaguely, I remember them talking about the 1919 Adventist Conference, where Ellen White, there was something ruling there about Ellen White. It was just newly discovered, supposedly, the minutes of those meetings. And SWAU, Southwestern Adventist University President Don McAdams, found some stuff about Ellen White and her plagiarism, and that was leaked, and people were talking about it. And I remember Des Ford.
The atonement on Calvary is not just one part of Christian doctrine. It's the lifeblood that runs through all biblical theology. It includes and presupposes every other truth. It includes all the things we need to know. All truth is wrapped up in the cross of Christ. All other knowledge except that of the cross is chaff.
And later on, the white lie.
They say about you in Time magazine, Ford's challenge was mild compared with the bombshell dropped by Walter T. Ray of Patterson, California, a veteran pastor. Ray, in the course of PhD research, stumbled across some long-buried writings by forgotten divines that matched huge swatches of Prophet White's books. And it goes on to say Ray was the first to document the vast scale of borrowing from 75 assorted books on history, doctrine, and the Bible. And last April, Ray issued his full findings in a book titled The White Lie. You're holding The White Lie in your hand.
And there was just a lot of things going on that I was around at that time, but the Dallas church was so just solidly Christian. Well, and I know as Christian, let me put it this way. I remember them loving the Lord. I don't remember anyone talking about anything that was like the Adventism of the day. Nothing like my husband was, and he was, raised in an Orthodox home. My dad's extended family were mostly in Keene, Texas, and that's an Adventist ghetto about an hour south of Dallas. And I remember sitting in the parlor of my aunt's house and listening to the debates on Sabbath afternoon, and it was thrilling. The house was filled with kids, all the cousins and uncles and aunts, and they'd all go out after dinner to play except for me. To the irritation of the women folk, I didn't want anything to do with the kitchen. I didn't want to make the food or clean up the food, but I begged to sit in with the men from the time it was probably 6, listening to them debate Ellen White and Adventism. And it was so exciting because, they'd get heated, and it kind of honed my skills of looking for who was right. So I really wasn't proud or ashamed of being an Adventist. That a lot of people like my husband was kind of ashamed of being an Adventist. But you know what I felt? I just felt different. And what Adventists had done to me is it just made me scared of people. See, I had assumed all Sunday keepers knew that they were doing wrong and had a rebellious heart. And if I was around them, I would be deceived. And I'm sure that a lot of Adventists relate to that statement. So our SDA elementary school teacher, when I was, I think, around 5th grade, read one of those Last Days books. I remember being terrified of persecution for keeping the Sabbath in the last days. That book really got to me. I hadn't really heard much about it before, but boy, reading that book, I would pray at night that I remain strong even under this duration. One time I remember I was so worried about the police making me watch as they gruesomely tortured and assassinated my little brothers and sisters that I remember running into my mother, and I fell faint near her bed. But she, it was interesting because I think she just thought I was being dramatic or something. I don't think she took me seriously, because she pulled me up next to her and just started laughing when I told her what I was upset over. And she just said, honey, none of those things are ever going to happen. And so the wonderful thing was I just believed her. And that was it. I never, after that, accepted the SDA Last Day prophecies again. Now, I had prophecy around me all the time, though, because I had an uncle. His name was David Fry. For 50 years, he was a professional eschatologist who had been raised Seventh-Day Adventist. And so we discussed prophecy all the time. We loved our Uncle David. We'd go out to his house, and hours he would tell us all about prophecy. But he didn't believe exactly like Adventists do. And so we were kind of open to many different scenarios. And I can tell you, during those years, I know this is not normal in the Adventist church, but I'm going to tell you anyway, I loved Christ from the moment I could think. I mean, I really did think that Sabbath made Christ happy. And so that's what I did. It was very simple for me. Jesus loved me and came to save me and died on the cross for me. And he wanted me to be good. And I'm 5 years old here, 4 or 5 years old. And so I was good. At age 12, I got a bunch of money for my birthday. And my birthday is near Christmas. So I got a bunch of money for Christmas and for my birthday. And so I went out and bought a bunch of Bibles. And I committed myself to reading the Bible through every year. Now that was my promise to myself, not to God, because I was so, it would have put me under too much pressure. I thought I would probably go to hell if I didn't keep a promise I made to God. So I just made a promise to myself that I did try to keep it. And as I got older, I realized, that commitment was too hard, because you'd start skimming. Once you got towards maybe October, and you only had 3 more months to go, I would just start skimming at night as quickly as I could, because I hadn't been very faithful, for a few months, maybe during the year, trying to keep up in the Bible. So anyway, what I did was at night, I would keep up the routine of going through the Bible once. But I knew that wasn't probably such a good idea. So when I was in college, I started a morning reading where I would go really carefully through the Bible. So I actually had 2 different readings of the Bible so that I could really understand it. At that same time, at 12, I wanted to be baptized. And, in Adventism, they really want you to wait till you're 12 to be baptized. And so I had waited and waited. And I remember I was almost 13, and I had gone into my principal and signed up to be baptized several times, and they wouldn't let me. This one time, the principal and the youth pastor of my church, and there was a man who came in that I didn't know who he was. But they brought me into the principal's office, and they told me they wanted me to get baptized that Sabbath. I just was like, okay, I have been asking for years, why in the world this Sabbath do you want me to? And they said, we want you to get baptized at this bowling alley. And I told them, but I would really like to get baptized at my church. I love my church. I want to get baptized there. And they said, no, the Lord is calling you to be baptized at this bowling alley. And they told me that they were having a Daniel and Revelation seminar in this bowling alley in Dallas. And I was very disappointed, but I did comply because I just tried to be a good girl. But what I later realized is they had used my baptism to boost their evangelization number. I had to walk through a bowling alley, which Ellen White had said we weren't supposed to go bowling.
The true Christian will not desire to enter any place of amusement or engage in any diversion upon which he cannot ask the blessing of God. He will not be found at the theater, the billiard hall, or the bowling saloon.
And there was a very busy, very loud arcade that you had to go to before you reached this little room where they had been doing the meetings. And they had set up this little baptismal tub that was, oh my word, it was awful. So I was baptized by some stranger, which made me feel a little bit guilty because I had agreed to participate in what I considered the fraud to boost their success for these seminars. I would later attend a Seventh-Day Adventist boarding school, and then later our family moved to Keene, Texas, so that all the Fry kids could attend Southwestern Adventist University, where most of them graduated. A lot of kids feel like, a lot of former Adventist kids feel like the church robbed them of doing something they felt like they really wanted to do. And so I've thought back on that and said, you know, what really did I feel robbed me because I was brought up Seventh-Day Adventist, some dream. And my parents were pretty liberal. And so the only thing I could think of is that I wanted to be in musical theater. I wanted to be like a Barbra Streisand, an Adventist Barbra Streisand or Judy Garland. But every single time I would go to a tryout, or I would, talk about with somebody, they said, oh no, you have to work on Friday night or Saturday, or during Sabbath hours. And so I was just, oh my word. And so I would get parts and then say, well, here's the problem. I can't work these days. And they would just give the part to somebody else. My grandmother on my mother's side, the one that was, more wealthy, wanted me to date John F. Kennedy Jr. And they had known the Kennedys. They did a lot of work together, and my grandfather was always at the White House. And so she was going to set up a date for me to meet him. But my mother was terrified of me not marrying an Adventist. So I never got to meet the Kennedys. All my grandmother's exciting plans of taking me to the Oscars and meeting all the Hollywood big stars was always crushed because my mom didn't want to push me being an actress. And, and the truth is, I knew in my heart that I wanted to be an Adventist, and I wanted to marry an Adventist, and I probably should be a pastor's wife and have lots of children. And so I didn't really get too upset by that. I knew there was a lot of evil in Hollywood that was much worse than breaking the Sabbath. But I just wanted to bring up a lot of people ask you, what did you give up? So that was it. I had a very long process of leaving. I wish I could say that it was just this one thing, but it wasn't. It was a series of shocks that Adventism, the Orthodox, the true Adventism was not like I had been raised. When our family packed up and moved to Keene, Texas, so that my brother could still live at home and attend Southwestern Adventist University, leaving the big city of Dallas, and that Adventism was very hard. Keene, Texas was almost 100% Adventist. The 1893 General Conference opened an industrial school in Keene, Texas. And all Adventists were there. And it was all Adventist. Even the post office closed on the Sabbath. And that made news. They were so excited. Our post office is closed on Sabbath and to keep Sabbath hours. And everybody went to the same church. There was only one church in Keene. And we had lots of family there. And that was the place, again, that we had all those long afternoon Sabbath debates, And I had grown up going to the Texas camp meeting that was held there. And I often thought that the Adventist kids were way wilder in Keene than in their big city counterpart. At least when Dallas Adventist teenagers took drugs or had sex, they knew it was wrong. Keene Adventist kids glorified in their rebelliousness. And I'm telling you, I'd hit some very wicked behavior that I would come home and tell my mother, and she just wouldn't believe it. It was shocking to everybody in Dallas. Nobody would believe Keene, but actually Keene was that bad. To me, the Dallas Adventists had seemed like true Christians. They were kind and unselfish. The fact that they had one foot in Adventism and the other in the Dallas culture, where they had to live and work, and Adventism was the tiny majority. Adventism was the tiny minority. Such a handful of Adventists in Dallas at that time, that it kind of kept them in reality. And it kept Adventism in Dallas from becoming radical and cult-like In Keene, no matter how nice the parents were, the kids were raised to be very incredibly unhealthy. When they would ever talk about anything spiritual there, they would talk about Ellen White and not Christ. In Keene, I found very little spiritual joy there. Everyone wanted to appear perfect and go to church on Saturday, but most of the people my age had utterly rebelled against everything, and everyone was sleeping together and having abortions, and nobody was feeling guilty. As long as someone was keeping the Sabbath, and that was the mortal sin of Adventism. Everything else was a little tiny venial sin. Arthur and I got married while we were attending university there. And because he ended up getting a job there after we got married, we got stuck there for the next 20 years. And see, my husband came from a good, super Orthodox Adventist background, which I'd never been around. He had never gone out to eat on the Sabbath, and I was with him during our senior year in academy when he ate his first meat, a hamburger. And I'm just letting you all know, my in-laws think that I was the bad one. I influenced him to do bad things, but I didn't. I didn't push him, and he'd never eaten it before, and he threw it right at the party. So anyway, one time we went to a wholesome Disney movie, and it was one of the really old wholesome ones. And after the movie, when we left the theater, he admitted he'd never been at a theater before. And so I kind of hated that I made him break his family rules. But in the end, he was much wilder than I was. After getting married, Arthur quit going to church. He had never actually liked Adventism. And the minute he got away from his parents, it was over. After we had kids, I begged him to come to church with us as a family. But I rarely ever won that argument. I, however, was very involved, in the Adventist church, just like I'd been raised. And I think it's very weird because I was a liberal Seventh-Day Adventist, and I stayed within the church, even though I didn't believe most of what Adventists taught. I was a joyful and committed Sabbatarian, and that's what kept me going. Where Arthur had been raised with the super orthodoxy, reading E.G. White daily, but he didn't have any joy accompanying that. Their families kept the rules, and he told me this one time. I think it's very typical that somehow his family incorporated shame even when they kept the rules, just in case they dared question them, even in their thoughts. So he was raised just terrified to question Adventism. And I think that that's a good thing for Christians in general to remember. It's a good lesson to learn. Joy keeps people in the church. The minute you start becoming this, dwell so much on legalism that you lose sight of Christ. And our family were happy as Adventists. Now, I knew there were a lot of things wrong, things that I questioned, but my relationship with Christ was so strong, I just looked the other way. Those Pharisee Adventists who kept all the rules were the problem, I thought. So when I moved to Keene, everything changed. I was now smack dab in the middle of orthodoxy. And I absolutely hated watching my children grow up in the culture. It was like spiritually stagnant, lukewarm bathwater that nobody ever cleans out. Everyone there seemed utterly oblivious. Everybody said, okay, Keene is a very good, safe place to live. It was very low in crime. But there was just a lack of Christ. Let's just be honest. It was like living in the mix of two movies. I don't know if you would recognize the movie, but it's The Trump Show and M. Night Shyamalan's The Village. Keene was sweetly creepy. I'm going to tell you some stuff that, you may want your small children to leave, but this really happened. This was an SDA pastor that I loved, we trusted, and I took classes from him. He was incredibly popular, and he advised young married students to watch porn. And so it was an oppressive spiritual oblivion that you were constantly having to figure out how to stay above if you were really a Christian. Now, there was really nothing different between the Seventh-day Adventists in Dallas and the Seventh-day Adventists in Keene, but how they, as far as being people, you know what I mean? They were the same people, but I could see what Orthodox Adventism did to people. The more one believes things that are not true, the more dysfunctional one becomes. And when you're in a bubble that fortifies the errors and nobody challenges it ever, like in Keene, this falsehood sinks into like a corporate normalcy. So this really isn't about people. Nothing really about people, but this is what happens when people believe falsehood for generations. No one ends up having the courage to stand up and question or shout. Once they do realize that, they shout that the emperor has no clothes. And so Keene was my first step of waking up to what Adventism really was. Now, I had various and sundry positions in Sabbath school and church and SDA schools, and I wrote for SDA periodicals. But what's coming next was the biggest shock of my life. I had found out that some SDA girls had abortions because they would even tell me. Their Bible teachers told them to, when they found out they were pregnant, to have an abortion. And even one instance, a girl told me that her Bible teacher drove her to have a secret abortion. I heard a friend's story who told me that she got pregnant by her seminary boyfriend, who was a seminary student, and her boyfriend tried to convince her to have an abortion, which she did. And then afterwards, she was suicidal. I had another friend who got pregnant before she was wed, and her SDA OBGYN suggested abortion and said, well, just don't let your life be interrupted. You need to finish your school. You don't want to, get an unwed pregnancy to stop you from your dreams. Well, I could not believe it. And so I started to look into what the Adventist Church taught about abortion. And so in the 1980s, I ended up founding the first SDA church organization that was pro-life. Because the church, the Seventh-Day Adventist Church, was pro-choice, and I could not believe it. It was the very first pro-life organization in SDA history, for the church. And I was president for 15 years. And I was going to change the church. I was going to change them and show them, don't be killing your babies. So the house of cards for me came down in 1989 when I was on the Seventh-day Adventist Human Life Committee at Loma Linda University that was deliberating the SDA view that was going to come before the 1992 Executive Committee to decide on what the Adventist official view on abortion was going to be. But let me tell you, what I heard so revulsed me that I knew that I'd either have to leave Adventism and be that Martin Luther that I knew I was, or fight from within. And I decided I was going to fight from within, and I stayed in for the next 12 years with my conscience always grinding in the back. How could I be a part of an organization that sanctioned killing unborn babies? Even if all the Adventists I spoke to were against it, they were against it in theory. They said, well, I'm never going to have an abortion. But they didn't want to get involved. The SDA belief that under the nature of man does not become a living soul until he takes his first breath. And see, that provided the theological reason for the church to be pro-choice. Now, most people hadn't read that. I don't think it was something that most Adventists said, oh, well, according to the nature of man, we can have abortions up until birth or up until the first breath because a child is not a living soul until that point. No, but I do think that there was something in the worldview of Adventism that just provided a way of a woman accepting the abortion. it really does affect how Adventists view human life. And so from 1989 to 2001, the year I officially sent in our resignation letter, it was very awful. Those years were just terrible. I could write an entire book about that, because it was then that I saw the zone out. Maybe that's not a good word. The zone out of the zombie-ish Adventist consciences. I saw that they would rather 1 million unborn babies a year be butchered than experience any persecution themselves. Because if they voted against abortion, that would jettison themselves into the last day persecution. And I think most people would understand that. But the whole thing was, if you can't have the 10 Commandments, you can't legislate morality, is what I kept hearing over and over for year after year. You can't legislate morality. And so that was kind of the first of the last straws moments for me anyway. So I sat down and I wrote my resignation, but then I was talked out of it by a pastor or family member, because I took it to several of them. Okay, so abortion was the first situation, and then the next one was the year 2000 General Conference session, where they voted that the Adventist Church was the sole remnant. I was very careful. I read every single word of what they brought to the floor, and they voted almost unanimously. The Seventh-Day Adventist Church is the sole remnant, which made me fall to the ground, arms straight out. I know this is going to sound dramatic, but I was by myself. I wasn't trying to be a drama queen, but I literally outstretched my hands and sobbed with my face on the floor. And I asked God forgiveness for our church. I had read scripture. I knew the heart of Christ was for unity, not elitism and fear. But the final moment was after speaking to Doug Batchelor.
This is how the devil destroys a lot of people. He buries the truth, he buries the diamond in broken glass. He takes the truth and he surrounds it with a lot of things that pretend to be the truth, and they aren't. And so when people war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God, the remnant church will keep God's commandments. And what was the other thing? They have the testimony of Jesus. What is the testimony of Jesus?
That moment, no one could stop me from leaving the church. Doug had come to the Keene Church for a series of meetings for the college, and I had run into him accidentally before he spoke one night, and I asked him to join our Adventists for Life. And he was very nice. He sympathized with our movement, and I quote what he said to me that night: "Do you want me to get fired?" Now, he was in a hurry trying to get to the meeting, and I understood that, and he was being flippant. And I'm not upset at Doug at all, but I did know at that moment my fight to get abortion to be seen as a sin in Adventism was completely over. If Doug Batchelor was scared of the people above him, then that was just it. I went home just sick, just heartsick that night. I got up the next morning and rewrote my resignation letter, I don't know, for the 5th time maybe. Now, I presented it to my husband the next morning, and he needed some time to think about it because he himself was considering leaving too, but for a different reason. So finally, it was on February of 2001, I turned my resignation into Ron Halverson Jr.'s office at the Keene Church. And on it, the first reason for leaving was abortion. The second reason was their view on salvation by works, which I'd always known was wrong. I was raised on righteousness by faith, and my parents were still in the church, so I had seen no conflict in that position. But since a family member told me that abortion was not a good reason to leave, I said, okay, fine. If I need more, I can find some reasons. So I listed all the reasons that I felt were wrong with Adventism. None of them, to me, was a reason to leave except for abortion, because, and this is the reason, I thought at that time that the church was changing. At least my own children were being taught more biblically within Adventism than I had been. And they were not being raised with the Adventist traditions of men. But what I did know, everything was changing, but abortion wasn't going to change. And that I had personally seen. So when I walked away, I knew life would never be the same again. I was flooded with sorrow, like there was a death in my family or something like that. But deep down, I have to tell you the honest truth, I knew God was proud of me and was with me and that I had done the right thing. And it was interesting because my parents didn't say much. Actually, nobody said very much to me. The church, no one. You know, it was just like dead silence, radio silence. Forever. No one ever tried to stop us. I think that nobody said at that moment anything to us because they thought it was a phase that I was going through and that I'd come back. So after leaving Adventism, this is going to sound weird, but I just questioned everything. I was like, okay, I have been so lied to. Everything I believed that was true is not true. And I didn't blame my parents or my grandparents. I didn't blame anybody because I knew they had just believed what they had been told. So I was on a quest to figure out reality. And so I said, okay, there's no boundaries for me. So I decided I'm going to look into atheism. And not that I wanted to be an atheist. I believed in God. But I thought, I'm not going to be scared anymore. I'm done being scared. And so I read every single book out there of Dawkins and Stephen Hawking and all the arguments against God. And I have to tell you, I thought they were all stupid. I have to be honest. I've never heard an atheistic argument that made any sense to me. But when you look at the blue sky and the love of family and singing and beauty, and especially reproduction, symmetry, language, and even time itself. These things could not have just happened. All arguments against God just seemed silly to me, even when I accepted that Genesis may not have been literal, and evolution needs to be considered. I even realized that time itself was a human construct, and what may look like eons to us may have been an instant to God. And I was like, okay, I'm so glad. I'm not going to be afraid. I'm just not. Now, we continued to keep Sabbath even after leaving Adventism for a while, because even though I didn't believe it was necessary for salvation, it was the thing I loved about Adventism. And I had no reason to stop. You know, I knew reading the Bible, it wasn't wrong to keep Sabbath. The Bible said you could follow your conscience on that topic, as well as eating meat. We're not supposed to be judging others. And so about after a year of I would say, mourning my entire life up until that time of not knowing truth, there's something that happened. God just opened the window. Well, I wouldn't even say open the window. I mean, he just let me out of the dark house. And joy flooded me. And I decided I wanted to embrace all the people from all the different denominations. I wanted to meet and greet with love everyone I had been told to be scared of, that was going to deceive me, because I knew they weren't going to. They had loved Jesus all along. It had been me, with my born and bred pride and prejudice. I had been wrong. The Adventists had been wrong. There were these sweet little Christian women like Aunt Bee and their little pearl earrings who went to Happy Sabbath on Sunday. And I was going to go out there and meet them and love them as part of this restoration that I needed inside of me. And I would show Jesus that I loved him by my love for his other children. And I can tell you, my heart exploded with this new world that Christ had opened up to me. And so after a couple of years of being thoroughly convinced it wasn't going to be a sin to go to church on Sunday, I had done my, hundreds of hours of research into, can I do this from the Bible? I decided to do it. Now, the day that I finally went to church on Sunday, Arthur was working, and my kids were all teenagers, and they were busy. So I decided to take the plunge. I was going to do it by myself the first time because I just wanted to check it out, make sure I was right. So anyway, so my husband's a travel nurse. And at that time we were in New Bern, North Carolina. And we had always passed this beautiful, historic Christ Episcopal Church. And that's the one I decided to go to break this curse of the law that had been over me for my entire life. And so I got into my car and started driving. And I kept saying to myself over and over, and and calming down my racing heart, it's okay not to be a Seventh-Day Adventist. It's okay not to be a Seventh-Day Adventist. I'm not hurting God. I'm not hurting my soul. And that it's okay not to be a Seventh-Day Adventist had been a mantra that I had going through my brain for years. And so I amused myself because I gazed into the rear view mirror and was looking for that little 666 to be emblazoned on my forehead. And I parked the car and walked into the church. And I have to be completely honest, I thought I had entered heaven. The music was sublime. And I could write another book, on the next few years as I visited every church that I could. All the different Baptists and Lutherans and Pentecostals and Presbyterians. Each time my husband took a new contract and we would move, I would get out my map, a local map, and I would pinpoint all the different denominations that I wanted to go to. And quite literally, and I'm not kidding you about this, I really did this. I would go, because my kids now are in college, and I would go to 4 to 5 services a week. Wednesday night in the Baptist, Saturday evening, because sometimes they have a Saturday evening at the Pentecostal or Baptist, and then Sunday at, the Lutheran or whatever. And I would go and I got to know people. I spent so many hours talking to pastors and asking them questions, anywhere from Seattle to Houston to North Virginia. All over America. I would sit down and discuss with all these beautiful, wonderful Christians what they believed. And I can tell you it was such a high. I loved it, and I never, ever wanted to officially join another church. I wanted to worship with the full body of Christ in any way they wanted to worship, whether it was clapping and jumping in the church or sitting still, whether the church was a high or low church. I just thought it was all amazing. And during this time, I began writing a book called It's Okay Not to Be a Seventh-Day Adventist. And I've never publicly told this story, so I want to really quickly tell it because so many people misunderstand. But I had a friend of mine when I was a Seventh-Day Adventist. He never went to church, but he always wanted me to take his son to church with my kids when I went, which I was glad to do. But one time I asked him, I said, I don't want to say his name, but I said, hey, friend, why don't you just go to church? And he said, I can't. He said, I did some terrible things in the Vietnam War, and I'm not proud of them. And I know that Ellen White, I believe Ellen White is a true prophetess. And so therefore, I'm going to hell. I'm never going to make it to heaven.
I was shown that God's people, who are his peculiar treasure, cannot engage in this perplexing war, for it is opposed to every principle of their faith. In the army, they cannot obey the truth, and at the same time obey the requirements of their officers. There would be a continual violation of conscience.
And he said, I have to accept that. But he said, I don't want my son to not get to experience heaven. And I just couldn't believe it. And that wasn't the only time I talked to him. I talked to him several times after that and just said, come on, the Lord loves you. You don't have to. And I knew at that moment I had to write this book. And I started writing it in my brain, but I never, ever expected this book. And the book's purpose was, if you have left Seventh-Day Adventism, if you aren't going, if you whatever you've done in your past, don't allow the Seventh-Day Adventist Church to stand in the way of you becoming a Christian and loving the Lord. Keep walking. And I was a happy Seventh-Day Adventist at that point. And it really was during those years that I started then actually writing it after I'd left. And that was one of the most surprising things when I was finished with the book, that I had written most of it after I had left Adventism. And that was not what I expected. It wasn't until 2008 that we decided to join the Catholic Church. And that was when my family and friends finally realized that our exit from Adventism was permanent. And that same year was when I wrote It's Okay Not to Be Seventh-Day Adventist, but that was when things got very difficult with my family and friends. It was one thing to leave quietly, but then to leave and become Catholic, and then to leave and write a book publicly, it was very difficult. My family had been too long brainwashed against Catholicism. So even though they were liberal Adventists, and they never brought us up with any of this belief of last day beliefs, it started to show up. One of my relatives, in fact, several of them came to me and said that, well, they had just had all this misunderstanding based on what Ellen White told us about the Catholic Church. And so even though they were liberals, they had read The Great Controversy, and they came to me and said that Catholics were conceited and that Catholics degrade the intellectual powers to serve their carnal desires. That's actually a quote from the Great Controversy.
While Romanism is based upon deception, it is not a coarse and clumsy imposture. The religious service of the Romish Church is a most impressive ceremonial. Its gorgeous display and solemn rites fascinate the senses of the people and silence the voice of reason and of conscience.
So my Adventist and family did not even realize at that time that they were breaking one of the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. So my liberal, E.G. White disregarding Adventists had fallen prey to the SDA anti-Catholicism propaganda, and they had never even realized it until I became Catholic. Some of them actually still believe that in the last days, they're going to be the object of Christian hatred, and they're going to be persecuted for keeping the Sabbath, and even martyred. We were at that time given a list of things we couldn't do around the family, like crossing ourselves or doing or sounding Catholic in any way. And I had one family member that just kept reminding me that, she said, now, Teresa, everybody mistrusts the Catholic, not just Adventists. And I agree with that. Protestants have pointed out corruption and theology that they disagree with, and I get that. That's not what I'm talking about. Adventist anti-Catholicism is of a very different quality and quality and quantity, because they add that Catholicism is going to murder them. And that's a future crime that Catholics have no way of rebutting. And that's very unfair. It would be like Catholics publicizing the fact that a saint had a vision that one day Adventist churches would be filled with cannibals and would kill and eat Catholic children. And let's just say that a whole bunch of Adventists began to believe it and joined the Catholic Church. See, that's outrageous and unjust slander that does not leave the lips of anyone who is Christian. Adventist slander against Catholic is demonic because it defaces brothers and sisters in Christ in the future in a way they can't defend themselves. I had just one thing I would like to say to them. And I was asked to say this. I wouldn't have done this unless Miles had asked me to do it, but I'm going to just pour my heart out. See, Christian scholars, my sweet Adventist loved ones out there, Christian scholars of all denominations have really, actually, sincerely studied the Sabbath question for centuries and centuries. And they have sincerely come to the conclusion that the Sabbath was fulfilled in Christ, or some believe that Sunday is the new Sabbath. These people are just as devoted to Christ as you are. They study the Bible with as much education, as much prayer, as much calling on the Holy Spirit. They are doing their best to understand scriptures. And it's very unfair and very unchristian to call them deceived or rebellious simply because they interpret scripture differently than you do. Some things that Adventists teach about this is demonstrably false, such as Ellen White wrote in The Great Controversy that Catholics hate the Bible Sabbath. Well, I can tell you I have now been a Catholic since 2008, and many, many times do Catholics go and worship publicly at Mass on the Sabbath. When you run the numbers, there are way more than 10 times as many Catholics in the United States in the pews on Sabbath, which they don't call Sabbath, they call Sunday. I mean, a Saturday, but they don't call Sunday the Sabbath either. But they are in church on the seventh day, in the pew worshiping God. So go out, Adventists. Don't be afraid. Go find the truth out there. Have faith enough in Christ that you're going to seek His kingdom above all else, and you've got to have faith that He's going to protect you. So He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. Now, this is what I told myself after leaving Adventism. The truth can withstand a nuclear blast. Have the courage and the faith to look outside that box of Adventism, and you're going to find that it's not the scary, deceptive place that you were told. God is good. God loves you. And don't be afraid. And that's it.